Hello. Hi, Jim.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Good to see you.
Um, I'm pretty good. Well, I have to say good afternoon there, right? Um, it's
Yes,
morning
about three
here,
o'clock in the afternoon.
right? It's 10 a.m. in Korea. Um, Thank you very much for joining us in this very interesting, promising to be interesting event. Um, we're
Happy
having
to
the
do it.
conversation in the middle of COVID-19. So naturally, we'll probably have to begin with some stories about COVID-19. Um, from looking at it from any angle, I'm sorry to say your previous administration has done a very poor job in in fighting against this terrible viral outbreak. But how does Hawaii fare uh, with respect to COVID-19?
Well, since you mentioned the former president, he did a very poor job in every way. So it was not exceptional, the inability to respond promptly. In Hawaii, we have basically followed the same sort of curve that I think exists everywhere else in the world. There are certain unique things about Hawaii compared to Korea or compared to the average state of the United States or many countries. We're an island or a group of islands. And that's given us a little bit more control over people coming and going than in other parts of the world. And so, as soon as it became clear that this was a pandemic, a global pandemic, that people were catching it by people flying all over the world and spreading it, we shut down to the extent we can as a state of the United States travel, especially tourist travel. And of course, our economy is almost entirely based upon tourism. So there was a lot of complaints and concerns, but it worked. The spike went down and things looked pretty good. So we opened up again. And of course, the spike immediately went up and it went much higher, much higher than it had been before. And that concerned everybody. So we closed it back down again. And we're now in the process of trying to open up again because people are just so tired of being cooped up. Although in Hawaii, it's not too bad because we don't have air conditioning or things like that. The temperature is so pleasant that we can keep doors open and go out on our lanais and so forth. And there's a bit of openness, and we can go to the beaches and things like that. So, as long as we retain distance. But nonetheless, from an economic point of view, we want to open up again. And we have the
Mm.
state of Hawaii is probably one of the most liberal states in the United States. And our governor and all the legislature are pretty progressive. They believe in science, for example, and take
Oh.
scientists' words about what we should do. And
Mm.
uh, but we now have a mayor who, if it were a partisan ballot, would be a Republican, and he's also a businessman, and so he wants to open things up again. And there's a contest between the governor of the state and the mayor of Honolulu, who Honolulu being by far the biggest town city here. So at the present time, we don't know. I'm very concerned about opening up because of what's happened to the virus, if I could say a word about that. As we all know, there was great confusion, still confusion, uncertainty as to where it originated and why it originated and how it spread around the world to various places and what to do about it. And some of the things that seem scientifically correct, such as ventilators, for example, perhaps were actually not good, resulted in unnecessary deaths, we now know. So there was nothing much known about it. We did the best we could. Now we know more and more about it, but the virus in the meantime has mutated. And so it's constantly changing itself. And even though we now have vaccines and many people resisting taking the vaccines, and unless we get worldwide cooperation, it isn't going to do any good. Things have just gotten in a situation where there is now the vaccines for the old virus, which may or may not be effective on the new virus. And then the last thing I'll say, which is characteristic of the situation worldwide as well as Hawaii, and that is a uncertainty about what the situation is for people who we think have not caught the virus. For example, we said young people are immune, but it now turns out that, in fact, people may have had very low grade evidence of the virus, but it will have long term effects. And I would say one of the most important elements of the entire pandemic is we don't know what the long term impact of having uh, been exposed to the and having caught the virus will have to our lungs, to our physical ability, and especially to our brains. There's very good evidence that there is mental problems are caused, brain dysfunctions are caused in people who either had mild or no evidence of it whatsoever. So, yes, Hawaii has done a fairly good job compared to other places. Not as good as Korea, as I understand it, although I also understand that Korea itself is now facing an uncertain future like the rest of us as well.
Yeah. Speaking of your new mayor, the city of Seoul, has elected a new mayor. And now, just as we speak, this morning, he announced different strategies to fight against virus. It's slightly different approach compared to KCDC, Korean Center for Disease Control. So we're a little concerned, but he's from Republican Party again, so he wants to open up a little for the benefit of business. So we shall see how it's going to fare, I guess. Now
Well,
you mentioned Hawaii.
I don't want to get involved with Korean politics, so I won't
Oh,
say anything about
me neither. But
that.
interesting that you mentioned Hawaii being island. Whether you believe it or not, Korea is an island too. If you
Yes,
think
it
about
is.
it,
You're right. You're
yeah,
correct.
it is.
That's right.
It's a peninsula, but because of North Korea, we are essentially, an island. So we had the same
That's correct.
problem,
Absolutely.
and and so we were a little lucky because it's almost like an island, but at the same time, um, your major business is tourism, but our economy is very much dependent upon trading. So we couldn't really, completely block the border. So that was the dilemma. So we had to, you know, consider all the factors and somehow very gingerly walk along this line. And all in all, our government did a fairly good job. But
Yes.
people are getting, as you said, getting very anxious these days. They're getting tired of being told what to do. So I'm a little concerned. Maybe impatience level is about to reach the maximum in a way.
All right.
As a futurist, what would you tell people? Future is uncertain, but what would you tell them?
Well, uh, first of all, yes, the future is uncertain, but it's almost, well, it's seldom as uncertain as it is now. I think that it is not. The analogy I use because I think it works in Korea as it does in the United States, is that COVID is like a baseball game. And the
Mm,
thing about baseball compared to other sports like basketball or soccer or things like that, baseball is not a timed game. It's not all over after an hour, and whoever wins within that time. It's in innings, and innings depend upon how long you're successful in playing the game. So one inning can last for hours. And while
mm,
the game itself is scheduled for 9 innings, something can happen to cause it to have to stop earlier. And there are many examples of games going on for 19 or 20 or 30 innings, which
mm,
sometimes last a day or so. And so that we can't assume that we're nearing the end. It may be, this is the thing about cycles. We may be ending a particular cycle, but that doesn't mean that there's not a new cycle about to begin or in the process of beginning. And that's what's happened so far. We've gotten confident, oh boy, we beat it, and then it goes up again. Oh no, we have to do something. Right now, we are tired of the game. We want it to get over. And it looks like we're winning. And then, just as we think we're winning, we discover all these new cases and countries that look like they've been successful. I'm thinking here of Sweden, who followed a completely different track and resulted in a huge mistake. But the person who responsible, the doctor, not a politician, responsible for the decision in Sweden of not of not closing down, but allowing people to continue, says what I just said. The game's not over yet. It's not over till it's over. And so far, there's no clear evidence, he says, that his strategy failed and that the strategies of closing things worked, especially for after the pandemic, when, if there is such a time, we're able to resume some sort of normal life again. So the main thing I would say to anybody is we simply don't know. It isn't over. And even once it is, as I said at the end a little while ago, the long-term effects we won't know until the long term. And that's one of the most annoying and troublesome things about it.
Your analogy to baseball really comes uh, directly into my brain. That's a perfect analogy. Now,
Thank you.
speaking of that Swedish doctor, you know that you can't really say something is a failure for sure because now my government has been doing very well, but right now we have very low level of immunity. Nearly no one has
Uh,
the immunity. So, but in Sweden, for instance, because so many people got exposed, their immunity level is very high. So now, if you compare
well,
right now,
it's higher, but I wouldn't call it very high. I think in the 20%. I may be wrong, but
right,
about that, I
right.
think.
So
So that's a
what
lot of people that are not immune yet.
one criteria I think the media often neglects to mention is really how many people have died. Very
Yes.
few people died in Korea. We still have a long way to go, but I think the saving lives is has to be the most important goal in this game. What would you say?
Well, yes, I agree entirely on that score. The U.S. has done particularly bad. And
Yeah.
Hawaii has done pretty well. We have not, we have had deaths, but comparatively few. Certainly proportionate, nothing like the United States and many of the states there who have had a much more open attitude, cavalier attitude to it, actually have very horrendous death rates. Still, I think that one of the features of COVID versus people's memory, let's say, or what they've been reminded about the last big pandemic, 1918, at the very end of World War One. That is still the reference for for our experience now, and deaths there were tremendously higher than they are now. And so, if that is the standard, and if we hear stories going back to the early modern times in London and Paris and medieval times in Europe, over in China and elsewhere, the death rate, even where it's comparatively high in the world today, is still relatively low compared to what it appears to have been in older times and in previous academics. And that thought, that belief, I think also makes people say, well, this is really not very important. I'm not dead, and I'm sorry my grandmother is, but she was going to die anyway. Maybe it's a good idea she died soon. Uh, this is has given us a strange attitude about the life death ratio in COVID.
Yeah, dude, I would agree with you 100%. Now, let me move on to post COVID era, so to speak. I know you always emphasize that we don't predict the future. We only forecast possible
Right.
futures, yes, alternative
Correct.
futures. But there are a few things that came out. I mean, we still don't know much about this entire event, but but we learn a few things. And although you don't you say we don't predict the future, sometimes I heard your lectures a couple of times before, and some at the end of your lecture, sometimes I don't know whether it's a slip of your tongue, but some things we predicted pretty well. Those kind of expression. I know we're not predicting the future, but learning something about this pandemic, what kind of future we could forecast, in your
Well, let
opinion?
me put it this way. I think there are elements of what has happened so far in the course of the pandemic that, if, unless something drastically new develops, we probably will carry over into the future. And the one that I see almost everybody quoting is that it turns out that teleworking is much more popular, much more efficient, much better in many ways than going face to face to do certain types of work. And so that I'd be surprised if we don't have more teleworking than we, once it's over, whenever that might be, than we had before. And that there will be contests about whether we should have more or less than that. Now, if you've heard me lecture before, you know that one of the things that I argue is that because of robotics and artificial intelligence and all this sort of thing, and because of the fact that we have major challenges from the environment, from climate change, that we need to turn our attention to, uh, that if I were a governor, if I were running for governor, if I were a policymaker, I would have a goal of full unemployment, full unemployment. I would work towards a society bit by bit that allowed us to continue what is already the trend of less and less labor needed to produce and distribute all the goods and services anyone can want as a result of increases in robotics and artificial intelligence and changes in materials that don't have to be mined and processed in the way old industrial things do. So that I don't think for a minute we're going to move to full unemployment as I see it. I'm afraid we're simply going to try to restore jobs. It isn't going to work. We'll have more people that are underemployed or unemployed who are poor. We'll have more people that are super rich. This is a recipe for global civil war, I fear. And because, in my opinion, we're not acknowledging the possibility of living in a way in which humans lived thousands of years ago in hunting and gathering societies where nature was abundant and it wasn't necessarily to work in order to live as it became later in agricultural and industrial societies. So, in a sense, full unemployment is returning the way it used to be, except the goods and services then that nature naturally provided to humans, and we were small in number then, can now be done through high technology. And so I have had several PowerPoint presentations with robotic groups in Korea. And I've tried to stress that they are not just involved in what's frequently called the fourth industrial revolution. They may be doing that, but that will be a quick episode. In the longer run, and it's not that much longer, they might be moving to full unemployment. In any event, certainly it seems to me there will be pressures for less physical face to face work and more like we're doing. And frankly, I have living in Hawaii, where I have spent almost all my adult life on airplanes flying all over the world. I love being to just sit at home, look out at the surf in Waikiki, and talk with you about these issues. Although I miss Korea very much, I actually would like to be there. But it's still, this is still satisfying intellectually and emotionally. And Zoom, my family loves Zoom. We're all over the world. A wonderful way to get together in ways we couldn't possibly spend Christmas together. Uh, but because we couldn't all physically get together, but we can Zoom together, and we have a great time. So I think that while there are problems, and I'm not sure education was ready to make the transition so quickly, and many businesses were not either, I think that's one of the things that might change in the future.
Silly question comes to mind. Last year, were you busier than before the outbreak?
Was I
Busier
was I busier?
then?
No, quite the
No.
contrary.
Okay.
I'm much
No.
busier now.
No, the reason why
I oh
I asked this
yes.
question is I was doing the similar kind of Zoom dialogue with Jane Goodall about half a year ago.
Oh,
Jane told me she was busier than ever before. She thought she was staying home, quietly. That lasted only a couple of weeks, and then all kinds of Zoom requests and all this. So she said she's sitting home, but um, at least 3 times a day she has to do this kind of things. So she became
well,
so
I wouldn't.
busier.
I'm not quite up to three a day, but I certainly am having many more Zoom. The list of things that I have done, of talks and so forth, now is vastly greater on a global level. If you compare just stuff here in Hawaii, it may not be enormously more, but at least I'm able to do more things globally by far. And I've been very, very busy. I contributed to my role as a futurist that everyone asks the question you asked: what's going to happen after? They want
Right.
to know so they can plan for it. And I unfortunately say, I don't know. No one knows. You can't predict
Who
the
knows?
future. That's right. So they give up, but someone else calls and asks me the same question. And so there's this great desire to know, and they, fortunately, from my point of view, have asked me to think about it. So it's caused me constantly to think about answering that question and to think about how to understand it. That's where the baseball analogy arose as a way to understand the ebb and flow. Oh boy, we're going to win. Oh no, they have a bases loaded home run. And so I get this sort of a feeling from having to prepare for so many presentations.
Hmm. Now, continuing that line of bugging you to forecast alternative futures. You mentioned that Hawaii faring pretty well, and Korea is doing relatively well. And I've been talking about this issue for the last several months in a way. Now, one of the things we really learned this time is to really think about nature again. I didn't really um, do any controlled experiments, but just by casual observation, the people around me, sometimes they used to complain to me. I mean, how come you always talk about environment, and you're always scaring me. Environment is going downhill, and we're going to have a tremendously difficult time. And we're doing well. I mean, you're just making up the story. Some of those people last year, I was watching them talking to other people. They were saying, "Are you out of your mind? Is there anything else more important than environment? I mean, that environment surrounds me. Now it's killing us. And what else is more important? You guys really have to be very much concerned about environment." I was very busy last year too because I thought it was an opportunity. Many people, at least, they haven't really um, come up with a perfect answer, but they were thinking about this. Perhaps we've been doing something wrong. Perhaps we've been hurting the natural environment too much. Maybe that's because we're getting this disaster. No, so I thought it's the time. Jane Goddard and I agreed that we've been trying to educate people for a very long time, but we didn't really do a good job. But this virus is doing a wonderful job. They're really teaching people um, about the way we deal with nature. So I thought it may be a great opportunity to educate the general public. So I gave a lot of lectures last year by Zoom, and then I wrote a lot of articles and books, and I was very busy. Now, I don't mean to say something against what you've been teaching us, but Alan Kay, the computer specialist, he said something like the best way to predict the future is to invent it. I'm not trying to invent the future, but I see the opportunity. I see people are ready to rethink about the relationship between us and the natural environment. Um, is there a future, a better future for us if someone like myself or Jane Goodall try very hard to I don't want to use educate, but to make people realize something is going on and we can change it for the better future. Does that does this make sense to you?
Well, first of all, I'm just delighted to hear that because there's several reasons for it. One is I am not a specialist in Korean affairs, but since 1980, I've had an occasion to go back and forth to Korea a lot and talked to lots of different people. And I would say that generally speaking, Koreans were not concerned about the environment. As long as I would talk about technology, high technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, yes, that was great. But as soon as I began talking about climate change or population growth, for matter, I think population decline is great. And the people in Korea say no. And so I'm glad to know that you feel the environment, the COVID has made people more aware of environmental type issues and at least willing to talk about them. I was saying this about Koreans. Americans are vastly worse in that regard. I don't want to suggest anything to the contrary, but I thought that the situation was somewhat different. Was I was surprised that Koreans were not as aware of the fragility and urgency of environmental issues. So I'm glad that might happen. Another thing I would mention is early on, when I was asked to talk about COVID, I used the analogy of a cleft in time. That the COVID had caused time to stop, that suddenly processes that seemed inevitable, that had to be ongoing, stopped. And other things seemed to be all right. Even though you closed down the economy, people were still getting food. People were still getting material goods, apparently without going to work. How was this working? So that everything was sort of crazy. And I said, well, the cleft in time gives us an opportunity to, in fact, realize that our economic system is by no means perfect. It produces all sorts of environmental and social and individual damage. You can really get a much better economic system than the one we have now. And without returning to a dark ages or something like that. It just is not just fine tuning, it needs fundamentally to be rethought, but it could be an economy that works for everyone and not just a few, for example. And certainly from an environmental point of view, because one of the things about COVID and the shutdowns is the environment is often recovered. Wildlife are recovering. Places that were polluted are not polluted. Mountains that you couldn't see because of smog, you can now see. And so people were aware that a lot of the damage that the environment, that the economic system had done, either were in the process of being uh, made better or could be with a little foresight. So I thought that was an important thing as well. But the environmental issues are urgent, in my opinion. Climate change, the movement of society from a Holocene epoch into which Homo sapiens evolved into what is now called an Anthropocene epoch, a artificial environment, an artificial world in which natural processes are all of them are interfered with by human processes. A new science for the Anthropocene era is necessary and I think now possible. So I'm glad to hear that you and Jane Goodall feel two pretty high powered folks there are feel that the environment is finally beginning to get the attention it deserves.
Yeah, you mentioned that while we stay home, somehow natural environment seems to like it very much. At
Very much.
various places in the world, wild animals come down to town and they walk around, they peek into the stores and all this. That was wonderful. Uh, I wrote an article a little while ago in my newspaper column. Uh, we used to think that animals like to move around at night because they are born that way. We even did a lot of research about the animal's eye has some sort of membrane behind the eyeball so that they can rebounds the light. So in very dim light, they can see better. And we were
Mm.
talking about, they were born that way. They don't want daylight or whatever. No, it turned out that wasn't really true. There were a lot of case studies that where tourism is very vibrant, like in Hawaii. When tourists are there, animals don't come out. They come out at night.
Mhm.
But tourism season is gone, then animals start coming out during the daytime as well. It's simply because we, the Homo sapiens, the the simply most dominant animal in the world, and so many of us are roaming around, and the wildlife, wild animals couldn't dare to come out. But this time,
Right.
we we couldn't come out of our house, so they came out, and they even peeked into our windows. Are you okay? And that
That's
paradoxically,
wonderful.
yeah, paradoxically, that tells us what kind of damage we've been giving, what
Right.
impact we're having on nature. And if it is just making their life somewhat uncomfortable, that's okay. But I think it is very clear that climate change and environmental destruction, biodiversity depletion, all these things all together has created this sort of pandemic. No one can tell you exactly, climate change is the cause for COVID-19, but there's a connection. No one can deny there's a very good connection. I was asked that question more than anything else in the beginning of last year when pandemic broke out. It was interesting. People just kept asking me, "Is climate change responsible for this pandemic?" I couldn't really answer definite yes because the environmental problems are so multifaceted. You can't really pinpoint, yes, this caused this. It's not like a physical experiment, right? And yet, since I was asked so many times, I kind of created a possible scenario and start talking about in my lecture. I said, well, when you compare the mammalian diversity between the tropical area to temperate area, there is nearly no difference if you exclude bats. But when you put bats into it, then the tropical mammalian diversity goes up tremendously. What that means is bats are basically tropical mammals. They live, most of them live in the tropics. But because of climate change, global warming, bat distribution is getting wider. They're moving into the temperate zone. Now that means
Mm.
physical distance between bats and humans are getting closer, right? Because most of us living in the temperate region anyway. So there could be more chances to to for a virus to move from bats to humans through some other wild animals. That was just a scenario I talked about for nearly a year. Miraculously, about 2 months ago, a paper came out from Cambridge University research team. They looked at the distribution change in bats in the last 100 years, and they pinpointed a few hot spots. One of the hot spots was southern China and northern Laos and Myanmar, in that area. In the last 100 years, 40, 40 new bats moved into from the tropics. And we know that a single bat usually carries two or three coronaviruses. So what that means is when you multiply southern China, there had been at least 100 new coronavirus strains came in. So there's a very good possibility that something could happen. Um, at the beginning, you said we don't know the origin, but um, whether it was really originated from China, no one could say. But until whatever the data we have uh, indicates that's a possible, southern China is a possible origin. I'm not saying that's the origin, but so climate change clearly has something to do with this pandemic. Um, and now we really need to worry about climate change more so than ever before. And when you think about it, virus would never make us go extinct because virus
Okay.
can only kill people when they infect them. Enough of us have died, then there's a naturally social distancing. Virus couldn't come from from the other person to me, and that's the reason why we the virus can kill so many people but cannot wipe us out. But climate change or biodiversity depletion could, because it's there's no barrier. We could go into a complete disaster and just disappear in a way. So I've been more or less lecturing this issue. This is really the time we really worry about climate change and biodiversity issue. And I heard uh, in one of your lectures on YouTube somewhere, you're also concerned about climate change quite a bit. And what's your what would you say to people at this point for post-corona era?
Well, first of all, let me say that's absolutely fascinating, very convincing story you just told. And I think it's just one example of the disruptive effect of climate change in all areas of life. I think that agricultural production is one that it's highly relevant to. We have climate has changed drastically over human society, and ever since humans, from my point of view, made the mistake of agriculture, they have been introducing all sorts of diseases that you pick up from other animals, that you pick up in the plants. We were relatively healthy as hunters and gatherers. We became extremely sick and subject to all sorts of plagues as a consequence of agriculture and working the soil and bringing animals together. But the last 200 years have been a relatively stable climate so that it was possible to plan for agricultural crops. Not likely, so it wasn't just science, wasn't science alone, or industrial technologies that produced food differently. We had relatively stable, relatively warm climate, and that is now being interrupted. And so, one of the biggest areas of concern caused by climate change, in my opinion, is agricultural productivity, food productivity, and the way in which it can be distributed and so forth. So I think that it is the number one issue facing us, but I do want to tie it together in my own thinking to automation and robotization and artificial intelligence and say that we need to bring those technologies not just to the production of more goods, different automobiles, different television, different iPhones, all that stuff, but to solve these environmental problems that are highly complex, highly interrelated, almost beyond the ability of mere humans alone to figure out. But as we develop models, computer models that examine these issues and begin, if we will, to respond to climate change positively, not by denying it, which is what we're doing now, or resisting it by putting up barriers and so forth, but rather by realizing we have to accept it and we have to begin to design with it, not against it. And therefore, the example you give, I take to, first of all, to be important for those of us in the United States who insist it came from China and is one reason why we should hate all Asians. I mean, I am so angry with my fellow Americans that I don't know how to. All I can do is apologize if their ignorance, but they haven't been led by people by you like you. They've been led by other people who want to stir up racial hatred as the cause of the virus. So they don't go with that bat theory. They go with the theory that it was a conscious effort on the part of the Chinese, and that is an unfortunate situation. So
Mm.
uh, I'm sorry. So
No,
that
that's fine.
the we are, I think, in a very different situation.
You mentioned agriculture. We made the agriculture became a source of our a lot of our problems. I know
Yes,
the Jared Diamond in his book he simply said agriculture is the biggest mistake humans ever made. But then
probably is.
that doesn't that doesn't mean that we should give up agriculture, right? We can't.
No, no,
Then many of us will simply go away. Now, the you mentioned climate change and agriculture, but as a biologist, I often tie biodiversity depletion and agriculture.
yes,
I'm a tropical biologist, so I go to a tropical jungle most of the time. My local guide, they always give something to me to munch on while we're walking in the forest. They know what to eat. They can pick. So they don't usually have a breakfast. They just go along and have a breakfast in the forest. There are many,
hmm,
many things to eat, but be, ever since we started agriculture, our diet breadth became so narrow, we eat the same thing over and over again. And that's probably why we get all kinds of nutrient imbalance and then related disease, I guess.
absolutely,
But
absolutely right.
again, but we cannot give up agriculture. So what should we do from now on?
Well, I think first of all, we need. I hope that millions of people are watching this and will think about the issues. I'm a bleeding heart liberal and believe that people are not fundamentally stupid, and that if their self-interest can be explained, and if scientific and policy actions can be explained, they will move appropriately. But I don't know where the leaders come from because I'm a political scientist, not a biologist. So I look at our governance systems as one of the major causes of our dysfunction. And if you've ever heard me talk about that, you will know that I say that our political systems are based on ideas from the 16th and 17th century, and our structures from the 18th century. And so we are just completely being governed by obsolete ideas and obsolete technologies. And we need to, if any institution needs to be modernized and updated, it's our government. And so I won't say that the most recent election of contrasting your president with your mayor is an example, but it is the current system of government requires us to fight against each other. It requires us to say, you're stupid and I'm right. And you haven't been able to do things correctly. If you bring me in, I can. And so, yay, the people say, and they bring them in. And of course, they have problems like anyone else. So this adversarial system in government and in law is completely contrary to the way humans want to discuss and resolve issues of conflict that in policy as well as in courts and law. And so that's just one example. It doesn't require a lot of high technology. But at the same time, technologies like the one we're using now, or like the cell phone, these things can be used intelligently, not in the way they're manipulated now by Facebook and Twitter, and by a very, very clever president. That's one thing I hand Trump. He knew how to use the media far better than any other politician in the U.S. did. And he used it for issues that I do not support, but his use of it was masterful. And it's just an illustration. He didn't do anything according to the Constitution, according to the structure, according to precedent. He did it according to the way the new technology enabled him to act. That's brilliant on his part. And we need we need to this in a way began in Korea. The very first uses of people power using cell phones and the local internet was in Korea, the very first governmental examples of it. But when you, oh, now I'm going to get myself into big trouble. But when you go about
Yeah.
deciding to move the capital from Seoul to Sejong, you build a building that, oh my heavens, expresses the exact opposite about government. It's this gigantic dragon that is consciously says power. The government is powerful and the people are tiny and incapable of doing much. That building, oh, I apologize to the architects and all the rest, but it just is not what was needed in to encourage further democracy. All you needed to use the electronic communication technologies for better purposes, in my opinion.
You know, uh, as I said, um, we need to now really think about climate change and biodiversity issues. And during this period where I couldn't really go anywhere, I had to write. Writing became more of the thing to do. So I just published a book about a month ago called, in English, Ecological Turn. You know that we have experienced several turns in human history, linguistic turn or cultural turn. Now people talk about, as you just mentioned a little bit, robotic turn, technological turn, or informational turn, all kinds of turns we can make. But having experienced this incredible pandemic, I am arguing that is there any other turns as valuable or as needed as ecological turn? We need to really reestablish the relationship between we, the human beings, and the natural environment. Um, the ecological turn is the only, in my opinion, now the only way we should go. Now, having said that, there are a few people who would listen, but when this thing is over, say, toward the end of this year, a lot of people got vaccinated, and even many people already feel maybe we're getting out of it. Not many people have died around my neighborhood, and so their mind is getting loosened. Now, when that happens, people will forget about this relationship between between the pandemic and natural environment destruction. Now, before that happens, I don't know whether it is a doable thing, but some sort of educational reform has to be in place. Why do we have to learn always just mathematics? Or in Korea, English seems to be so important. But we have experienced this. Why don't we learn ecology, for instance? Why don't we learn about nature and the relationship between nature and we, the human being? Isn't it something that is so important to teach? But at school, we don't teach things like that. And that's probably why we still get politicians who don't understand what we talk about, what we are concerned about. I wrote an article a little while ago, just before the election this time, looking at all the candidates. No one talked about environment issue.
Mm,
I thought, where are you people coming from? You guys didn't go through pandemic like us. I don't understand you guys. that's the
yeah.
that's the essence of my article. Um, would you join us in building up some logic that we really need to learn about learn about the world, learn about the natural world, that we are part of it? What would you say?
Well, first of all, the educational system, university system, certainly needs to be modified. But we need to understand the universities, like the government, were built specifically for economic growth, to make people who can be producers and consumers. And now that most of the production is being done automatically, to teach people how to be consumers. And so our entire educational system is oriented towards growth. Korea is uh, building more new universities. I don't know who's going to attend them since the population's declining, but they're all technologically oriented with a little dab of humanities here and there, and almost no environmental except green space. Well, green space is nice, but that's like putting a band-aid on a cancer wound. It isn't gonna, it's not the issue. And so I'm absolutely 100% behind you on that, and discouraged that the 11 or 12 candidates were silent on the most important issue of all. One good thing about American national politics now is Biden has finally become convinced, the Democrats have finally become convinced that sea level rise is real, and that it can also be part of a positive economy, that there are jobs and so forth in it. But regardless, something's got to happen. The problem is Biden is only going to have power, and it's very weak power, for about 2 years. And then it's very likely that Trump type perspectives, or other perspectives denying climate change and wanting to do other things instead, will return. But my suggestion is, to the extent Korea does make the mistake of listening to what Americans like myself say, if America is finally talking about climate change, then now is the time perhaps to get Korea to really do something serious about it. Uh, Korea can no longer follow the rest of the world. It needs to become a leader. If you've heard me talk, you know I say that over and over again. What worked for the past 50 years is not likely to work for the next 50 years. And one of the areas that Korea should focus on are the environmental issues. Now, you keep talking about the natural world, but my perspective is there is no natural world in the sense of
Mm,
major processes uninfluenced by human activity. We need a new science, the science of the artificial, that takes what are still processes that emerged over evolutionary time with things that humans have interfered with in order to govern evolution, in order to take care of this garden that we created out of a wonderful self-governing wilderness.
Wonderful. I was going to ask you to as a final word, in a way, is there anything you want to tell to Korean people? You already did, but let me ask you to wrap it up. Let me ask you again. Um, I am very encouraged to hear from someone like you that now Korea can take the lead in the world setting in a way. Um, what should we do first? What should we do first to
Well,
really
first of all,
do that?
you need to understand that you can do it, that you have what is necessary. You have spent a lot of money and time educating among the most intelligent people on the planet now. And you have also developed very creative people. So far, for the most part, they have improved. They've done what industrial people did. They improved on other techniques. But at the same time, Korea is becoming more and more innovative in more areas. So encourage more of that. Encourage more true creativity, true innovation. I use the example of Paik Namjoon. Do you know who that is? He was
Mhm.
yes,
Yes.
I believe he's now being respected finally in Korea. I think we need a whole nation like him in all of the areas that are important, not electronic music, but in the biological, the other areas related to the Anthropocene epoch. You have that. So have confidence that you do. Secondly, understand you need to do this cooperatively. It's not something where you're going to tell the rest of the world what to do. You're going to work together as a good leader. And I say this especially Japan. I lived in Japan for many years. I can read and write Japanese. Well, not write, read and speak Japanese a little bit. I love the country, but it really hurts me to have Korea and Japan constantly living in the past. It was an awful past. Japan did horrible things. These cannot be denied, but that isn't going to get us anywhere. These two countries, among the smartest people in the world, are able to be leaders. And the same is true with China, with Vietnam, with all of the countries here. But I would expect back off from what I said about China. I think you ought to get together with other small countries and not focusing so much on the U.S. I considered countries like Sweden and Finland, the Netherlands, Malaysia, Singapore, small countries, a league of small, intelligent countries that are not going to try to destroy the world, not going to get in major fights with each other. You're the guys who I think can exercise leadership. And I think Korea should take the first step. You are highly respected internationally now because of your political leadership, because of your success with COVID, because of the Korean wave pop culture, you name it. And kimchi, gosh, Korean food is real popular. So go for the whole thing. I think now is the time.
Wonderful. I don't want to add anything to it. I am afraid I'm going to spoil it, but I want to say just one thing. Our kids are so creative, and we
Yes.
just don't want to mess with them. Let them grow creative. That's my hope. Thank you very much for a wonderful conversation today.
Thank you
Okay,
very
be
much.
healthy.
I thoroughly enjoyed
Okay,
it. Thank you.
thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.